seminar series. It is my great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Roman Feiman. Uh, Roman is Thomas J. and Alice M. Tisch Assistant Professor of Cognitive and Psychological Sciences and Assistant Professor of Linguistics at Brown University in the US. Roman completed his PhD at Harvard University and completed postdocs at the University of California at San Diego and at Harvard. His research focuses on language, thought, and reasoning. For example, one of his research questions is how children can develop the ability to produce and understand an potentially infinite variety of sentences and maybe even thoughts. Today, Roman's going to be talking to us on the topic of deep learning and how it can inform theory in psychological science. Deep learning is a machine learning, computer learning technique that underpins some of the amazing new AI tools. And I know in the audience today we have many people who are in education. AI tools such as ChatGPT are having a huge impact in education. Some of that is as a sort of fantastic productivity enhancing tool for teachers to help us prepare our lesson. Some of ChatGPT is subverting some of our long cherished assessment tools, such as independently written reports. But ChatGPT, I have like 14-year-old kids, so they are always using it as a tool to help with their homework. So potentially it's an amazingly powerful tool for students to use to support their learning, but also not entirely accurate. So today we'll be really interested to find out whether these deep learning tools are really clever in the way that humans are clever. And I hope Roman's going to be telling us something about whether the success of tools like ChatGPT, which is really just trained on a very large body of text or on images from the internet, whether that tells us something about how our own minds are working. So I will hand over to Roman. Really looking forward to today's presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Michael. Yeah, this is extra fun for me because I'm primarily a developmental psychologist and to some extent an adult cognitive psychologist. And I've really started working on deep learning and large language models just in the last couple of years, mainly through my colleague at Brown Computer Science, Ellie Pavlik, and everything I'm going to be showing you today is in collaboration with her. But I've gotten really interested in the question of whether these incredibly impressive, successful programs can be models of at least some aspects of how the mind works, which is what I've been trying to figure out without using them before. And my prior on this was absolutely not. But I've been gradually changing my mind, and I'm going to show you some of the evidence that's leading me to change my mind. And yeah, I'm hoping we can discuss it. The first thing I want to point out is that this question of whether deep learning can inform theory in psychological science, whether it can tell us something about how the mind works, it is not a new question in an important sense. The architecture of these models, models like ChatGPT, other large language models, there's in many ways, there are some fundamentally new engineering principles in them, like the transformer architecture, a few other things. But it's actually not even totally clear how important those are to their incredible performance. The thing that seems to be the most important for their incredible performance is that they're just bigger versions of the kinds of models that we've had since the 80s. And since the 80s, there's been this debate on what those kinds of models can tell us about how the human mind works. Kind of famously around 1986 to 88. In 1986, this book came out. One of the authors, the last author here, is Jeff Hinton, who just won the Nobel Prize in Physics, in part for this kind of pioneering work, where they introduced what they called at the time connectionist models, these connected neural networks where lots of nodes are connected to lots of other nodes, and none of them intrinsically have any meaning, as models of potentially how the mind works. And shortly after that, there was this raging debate about whether those were plausible. So I think the most famous and maybe the best articulated opposition to the view that these models could ever tell us how the mind works was this wonderful paper by Jerry Fodor, who's a philosopher, and Zenon Polishin, who is a psychologist, a vision scientist, um, arguing that in principle, these sorts of models can never work the way the mind does because they have sort of fundamental limitations. The main limitation that they have is that they're not symbolic. They don't have a kind of symbolic architecture where internal representations in the models stand in any direct way for things in the world, and then those symbols can be independently manipulated of each other. Now, I'm being a little vague about what exactly a symbolic architecture is. And that's not just me, that's, I think, everyone. There's never been a very clear definition or statement of exactly what makes something a symbolic architecture. But if you have ever programmed anything in computer code, that's the rough kind of picture that people have in mind here. It's something like a programming language where there are constants in that language, there are functions, there are arguments to those functions, and each of those things can kind of move independently of the others and be called and used independently of the others. That's the sort of thing that arguably connectionist models don't have, didn't have, maybe can't have. And that's the sort of thing that Fodor and Polishin were arguing about. I would say if you get nothing else out of this talk, if you're interested in this question of whether ChatGPT can model how the human mind works, this paper by Fodor and Polishin it's just like brain food. It's more and more I come to think that it's wrong in lots of important ways, but the arguments in it are just so deep and rich and interesting to think about. I would just really encourage everybody to read it if you haven't already. It's a pretty old paper, so probably some people have. So in this paper, Fodor and Polishin make a variety of different arguments for why we need a more symbolic type of, programming language type of architecture, and why connectionism can't do the trick. They give a bunch of different properties that symbolic architectures have that they argue connectionist models don't. And a lot of these have received a lot of attention. I'm not going to go in any detail into most of them. The one that I actually want to focus on for the purposes of the rest of this talk is this last one, logical reasoning, which I don't think has received really very much attention in the comparison of humans and connectionist networks or language models. Fodor, in a different paper, has a really nice way of laying out how he thinks humans do logical reasoning and why a neural net can't do it the same way. And he starts with this passage where that's just taken directly out of a Sherlock Holmes story, The Adventure of the Speckled Band. So I'm just going to read this out loud to you. I think it's first of all, it's a wonderful piece of writing because it's, Arthur Conan Doyle, but it's also just a really kind of interesting bit of psychology, right? So this is the point at which Sherlock has unraveled the entire mystery. He's solved the crime, and he is telling Watson, who he thinks did it and how he came to that conclusion. And Watson gasps and says, something like, "Wow, amazing." So here's Sherlock. He says, "I instantly reconsidered my position when it became clear to me that whatever danger threatened an occupant of the room could not come either from the window or the door. My attention was speedily drawn, as I have already remarked to you, to this ventilator and to the bell rope which hung down to the bed. The discovery that this was a dummy and that the bed was clamped to the floor instantly gave rise to the suspicion that the rope was there as a bridge for something passing through the hole and coming to the bed. The idea of a snake instantly occurred to me, and when I coupled it with my knowledge that the doctor was furnished with a supply of the creatures from India, I felt that I was probably on the right track." So Holmes is narrating, right, how he came to the conclusion that the doctor did it in the snake down the bell rope, but he's also telling us reasons for how he came to that conclusion. And so Fodor goes on, what's interesting for our purposes is that Holmes' story isn't just reconstructive psychology. It is also reconstructive psychology, but it does double duty since it serves to assemble premises for a plausible inference to the conclusion that the doctor did it with a snake. What connects the causal history aspects of the story, so what caused one thought after another in Holmes, to the plausible inference aspect is the fact that the thoughts that fix that belief that the doctor did it with a snake are grounds for believing that the doctor actually did it with a snake. Right? They're not just part of a causal history, they're also good reasons. Now, were this not the case, so were there not this general harmony between the semantical and the causal properties of thoughts, there wouldn't, after all, be much profit in thinking. And the idea here is, compare this to how neural networks work and how they learn to think, where essentially all they're noticing is associations between co-occurring words, maybe larger associations over associations, right? So correlations of correlations of correlations. Essentially, all they're doing is picking up more and more abstracted statistical patterns in the kind of input that they see. And Ford has this lovely line about this, which is, so compare the sort of mental history that goes, bell ropes always make me think of snakes, and snakes make me think of snake oil, and snake oil makes me think of doctors. So when I saw the bell rope, it popped into my head that the doctor and a snake might have done it between them. Now, maybe that's mental causation, but it's not thinking. What you want to make thinking worthwhile is that trains of thoughts should be generated by mechanisms that are generally, at least, truth-preserving, so that a true inference generally suggests other inferences that are also true. Right? This is sort of the essential character of thinking and of reasoning, is that there's a kind of tight coupling between what causes one thought from another and what justifies having that thought given the previous thought. I think this is a really just interesting point, right? It's an interesting, and I think to me when I read this, rung as a very true statement about just the sort of fundamental character of how human reasoning works, at least on some level of description. Maybe it's not perfect, maybe it doesn't always do this, but it does seem right to me that the reason why we bother reasoning at all, the reason why we think, why we have these sorts of thoughts, why we find it engaging to read the kinds of thoughts that Sherlock Holmes was narrating, is exactly this sort of idea. And this goes, Fodor's argument is that this is a priori ruled out for neural networks. Because all they can do is learn statistical patterns of associations between their inputs, there will just never emerge any sort of notion of rational transitions between thoughts or reasonable truth-preserving transitions between thoughts. Now, for Fodor and Polishin in their paper, these are sort of a priori statements. These are claims about the architecture of neural networks and what that architecture in principle can or can't do. But I just want to highlight that these are really empirical claims, right? The idea that neural networks cannot think like this just really depends on how it is in practice that neural networks think. When you interact with, ChatGPT, for example, to the extent that ChatGPT is actually acting like it is reasoning in this very rational, truth-preserving way that Fodor says is a requirement for good reasoning, then it's just doing it, right? That's sort of empirically adequate. And if they're doing that, then that's something that we maybe have to wrestle with. I think it's just empirically true that neural networks today are increasingly good at this. They're increasingly doing things that Fodor and Polishin had argued only symbolic systems could do. That's just an empirical statement. And not just in their behavior, but when we try to understand how it is that they're doing what they're doing, they also look like they're exhibiting the kind of internal structure that, again, was supposed to be the advantage of symbolic systems. So things like, role filler independence, things like compositionality of thought, all of those desiderata that Fodor had on that previous slide that I didn't go into so much, but in particular also elements of reasoning. And that's the part that I'm going to go into today. Now, I don't know yet, this is, I think, very early days. I don't know yet what exactly this means. I'm not ready to say that this means that the mind is a neural network and that nothing else is necessary. I think that there are some really, really interesting dissimilarities too. But I think that the fact that neural networks are capable of doing things that we just did not think they could ever do is interesting and is telling us something. And given that this is just early days, none of these models have been out for more than a couple of years and they're constantly getting better. I think it's just important to try to figure out what it is that they're doing. So the rest of this talk, I'm gonna do in two parts. One is this kind of blend of a philosophy paper and an empirical review paper that is actually the same as the title of the talk. So how can deep learning inform theory in psychological science? That paper was published in Current Directions last year. So I will go through it in a bit less detail. If you're interested in the paper, we go through a lot of kind of case studies of how understanding neural networks is starting to help us to understand the mind. I don't think that there's like a really knockdown case where it's revolutionized how we understood something about how the mind works yet, but there are some cases where it looks promising. So in that paper, we go through some of those, and I won't go through that in much detail here. Instead, what I'll do is I'll pick this one case study of logical reasoning, and I'll tell you about a study that we've done more recently and some other work that we have underway that is looking at that and arguing that neural networks might be able to tell us something about how the mind works, specifically in the case of reasoning. Okay. So let me go through just an outline of the first part, that kind of first philosophical bit. By the way, I'm seeing that there are things in the chat coming in, but I'm not checking the chat just because I can't do that while talking. I hope that's okay. If there are questions, if there are like urgent questions or clarification or anything, just maybe somebody can raise their hand or interrupt me. I'm happy to do that. But I just can't read the chat and look at my slides at the same time. Okay. So there have been historically kind of two arguments. I think they're kind of extreme arguments for why we should ignore neural networks completely, for why neural networks just fundamentally can't link up with psychological theory. One is this kind of argument that usually comes from boosters, from proponents of neural networks, that argues for eliminativism. This is like a philosophy term, but all it really means is there are just some aspects of explanations that you want to eliminate. We used to believe that there were witches and that witches explained things about how the world works, why certain things happen. And then we, at some point, just decided that that was not going to be a part of any good explanation of how anything works. Like, it's just not a good construct to have. It's not a useful scientific construct. And so we just did away with it. And so maybe the way that witches went, things like symbolic structure in the mind or mentally represented rules is going to go the same way. We're just going to eliminate these ideas. And, psychologists are kind of familiar with this idea of eliminating constructs that we once used to hold on to. A lot of Freudian ideas like the ego, the superego, the id, these are still in, a lot of textbooks. And there are, of course, many people who study these things, but most contemporary explanations in cognitive science and psychology just don't invoke these constructs. They just don't think that they're real or that they're useful for explanation. And so the idea is that maybe all of the kind of symbolic structures that we used to want to explain things are going to go the same way. Now, that might eliminate a lot of stuff. It might eliminate notions in folk psychology like beliefs and desires. It might eliminate constructs in formal linguistics like, syntactic categories, nouns and verbs, or composition rules or movement rules or any of those sorts of things. And there are, in fact, modern versions of this kind of eliminativist argument. This is a really high-profile paper by Steve Pantadosi, kind of made a big splash, got a lot of linguists really angry when it came out, partly because what he called Chomsky's approach to language is not just Chomsky's approach, it's just like what all linguists, including ones that really disagree with Chomsky, what they've all been doing for a long time. And so he basically argues that just like, look, these things work really well. Language models work really well in things like producing language, which is what linguists have been wanting to explain. And so, and they don't rely on or implement any of these sorts of theories. And so we just don't need the theories. Let's get rid of the theories. Let's look at language models and have them be our theory. Now, I think the main thing that's wrong with that, I won't spend too much time on this, but the main thing that's wrong with that is just that I think we want theories that we can understand. If we have a model that does something really well, has really empirically adequate behavior, but we still don't understand how it works, it's not maybe it's a good model, but it's not a very good theory, in my view. I think that there's more arguments for that in the paper, but I won't go through that too much. I think there's in some sense, more interesting other extreme argument for why we should not care about language models if we care about psychology, which is Fodor and Polishyn's original challenge. And again, we're calling it epistemic insulationism here. That just, again, sounds like a highfalutin philosophy term. But all it really means is that no matter what you learn about language models, it's not going to tell you anything about the mind. They give kind of two arguments or two horns of a dilemma for this. Either neural networks are going to empirically lack core cognitive properties. They're just not going to be adequate, right? So they're not going to be able to do compositionality, so compose concepts or compose words in the way that humans do, or they're not going to be able to do rational reasoning the way that humans do, for the sorts of reasons that I gave you with that Sherlock Holmes example. Or if they are empirically adequate, then they're going to be mere implementations, right? Then they're just going to be lower level implementations in terms of, some connectionist, non-symbolic, sub-symbolic architecture of theories that we're going to independently want to develop and understand anyway. And so these are sort of the horns of the dilemma. Either they don't work as well as people, they don't behave as well as people do, and so they're just not going to be good models of people, or they do behave the way that people do, in which case the specific way in which they're implemented is not going to help you get a theory of how it is that people do that thing. And there's a kind of powerful utility to this view, kind of an upshot, which is that psychological theory is autonomous. It can keep going, keep doing whatever it's been doing without paying any attention to what is developing in neural networks, because nothing that's developing in neural networks is going to tell you what the right psychological theory is. You should just keep developing your psychological theory as you were. Now, it hinges on this kind of mere implementation idea. And I think there's a kind of guiding intuition here that might be helpful to spell out. Right? Imagine implementing the game of chess. The game of chess is famously multiply realizable. There are lots of different ways to play chess. There are lots of different media in which you can implement the game of chess. In fact, it's not just multiply realizable, it's multiply realized, right? People play chess on boards with pieces that look like different kinds of parrots, or you can make pieces out of corks, or you don't have to have a physical board or physical pieces at all. You can play chess on your computer. That's probably the most common way that people play chess these days. And the point is that they're all playing chess, right? There's a higher order thing that all of these physical implementations have in common that is chess. And the idea goes that if you want to understand something about how chess works, you don't want to care too much about any of these implementations because there are a lot of specifics to the implementations, like that the pieces are made out of cork or wood or implemented in a computer or whatever, that are actually irrelevant, right, to it being the game of chess. So if you have theories like, well, the game of chess is, that game where the queen is made out of three cork pieces of about equal size, and the king is made out of four, and the last piece is the smallest or something, you're just going to be wrong. So implementation is just not going to be relevant to rules, and you can't reduce the rules to their implementation because there are lots of different ways to implement the same set of rules. So that's the kind of guiding intuition for why neural nets aren't going to be able to tell us something about how the mind works. Neural nets are just one implementation. And if we study the properties of that implementation, what we're going to learn is a bunch of things that are probably not very relevant to understanding, the actual rules that we might be interested in, the kind of higher order description. Okay, so if that's how it works, who cares? Right? Why should we care about neural nets? I think there's a very simple move that we can make to kind of reject this intuition and reject this argument, which is just, look, we already know how chess works. The reason that this entire intuition comes up is that we know the rules of chess. We can write down the rules of chess. And so we can see that when we implement the rules of chess in a bunch of different ways, there are implementation differences between those different ways of playing chess that are irrelevant, that don't determine whether you're playing chess or not. But all of that rides on the fact that we already know what chess is. Like chess works like this. Like these are all the rules of chess. They're pretty succinct. You could write them down in a pretty short form. If we already knew how the mind worked at this kind of perfect level of description, I think that the intuition that any implementation of it is just an implementation would be right? There'd be kind of nothing further to learn. But the whole point is that we don't know what the rules of how the mind works are. We're trying to infer those from a bunch of behavior. And in that case, it's actually very relevant to look at particular implementations that are implementing those rules and then trying to figure out what the rules are. So imagine that you didn't know the rules of chess and you were trying to discover them from watching a game or even just looking at the board and looking at the pieces. In that case, it might actually be very, very informative that, all of those pieces in the front row have the same shape. And when you look at them, that they all move the same, when you look at a game, I mean, that they all move the same way, right? That might give you powerful evidence with which to infer something about what the rules of chess are like. I think this is much more like the position that we're in with respect to trying to infer how the mind works from the behavior that we can observe in people. Right? So to put it in like a philosophy slogan or something, the fact that the implementation and the higher order description are independent or ontologically autonomous doesn't mean that one can't tell you about the other. Right? They can be independent to a large extent. They can have sort of an independent, separate existence, but the implementation can still be massively informative about what it is that it's implementing if you don't already know how that works. And so this is the kind of view that we advocate in that paper, this kind of informative implementation view. If neural networks, language models, ChatGPT, are behaving the way that people do, if they're empirically adequate, then by looking at how it is that they're achieving that behavior, we can at least get some hypotheses about how it is that humans are doing the same thing. So deep neural networks aren't themselves theories, but they can inform theories about how the mind works. And even if a deep neural network does implement some rule, it may just be a different rule than what we had previously hypothesized because we don't already know how everything works. So we can use these models to explain how the mind works without explaining it away, without saying that we don't need psychological theory anymore at all. Now, this is just a figure from the paper, so sorry if it's kind of coming at you all at once. But the point that we want to highlight here is just that both of these, both the kind of eliminativist view of like we don't need psychological theory that's in the red box there, and the insulationist photo and volition view that's in the blue box of, they're just irrelevant for psychological theory. Both of those views actually depend on a kind of common problem with neural networks, which is that they're often black boxes for many purposes. We just often don't know how they work. We know that they are producing behavior. Maybe that behavior is empirically adequate, like maybe it's doing what humans do. But if we don't know how it's producing that behavior, then we're kind of stuck between these two positions. We can either say, well, they're irrelevant to theory, or we can say they may call other theory obsolete. They just are our best theories. What's needed to have them actually inform our theories is to be able to understand how they work, to be able to interpret parts of neural networks, subcomponents of neural networks, in terms of higher level psychological terms, not just in terms of the mechanistic, linear algebra or matrix multiplication or nodes and weights, which is the kind of vocabulary in which neural networks are built, but actually in terms of higher level psychological explanation that we're already kind of familiar with. Okay. Now, in that paper, in the current directions paper, we go through a couple of case studies where we think that there are, some of that has been done and there are really promising, interesting next steps. But there's a case study that we've been pursuing, which is logical reasoning, and that's what I want to tell you about next. So one question that I think we can start to use neural networks to ask is how rational is human reasoning really? The idea here is just the same kind of research program that I just laid out, right? So we're first going to see if neural networks are empirically adequate models of what humans do, whether they reason in a way that matches how humans do, in a certain case at least. And then we're going to examine how they're actually doing that using tools that maybe we can't use with humans that just aren't available, don't exist. And that's going to inform what it is that people do. So if we can find that the neural networks are reasoning the way that people do behaviorally, and we can look at how rational they are, if it turns out that they're reasoning the way that people do and they're behaving really rationally, that's great. If they're behaving really irrationally, that's, great too, as long as they're matching human behavior. Right? So either way, it's going to tell us something about how people think. Now, I mentioned that I started with this view that people's reasoning is very, very rational and kind of truth-preserving, that there are these reasonable transitions truth-preserving transitions from one thought to another that make up an argument, that make up justification for believing in a conclusion. But of course, there's also been a completely opposite view that's been, I think, much more dominant in most of contemporary psychology, which is that human reasoning is not nearly this rational. Danny Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow, I think, articulates this view really beautifully, right? Says, basically he's telling Fodor that, everything Fodor thinks is just kind of an illusion here, like it's kind of cognitive illusion. So we think, each of us, that we're much more rational than we are. We think that we make our decisions because we have good reasons to make them, even when it's actually the other way around. We believe in the reasons because we've already made the decision, right? So this is a kind of view of human reasoning as rationalization. First, we do something, maybe due to internal processes that are not very rational, that are not very truth-preserving. And then we try to kind of make up a reason why we did that thing. And when we do that, maybe the reasons that we make up sound a lot better, sound a lot more rational, sound a lot more truth-preserving than our internal cognitive processes ever actually were. So, Sherlock Holmes might be doing a piece of like reconstructive psychology when he's narrating his reasoning, but it's really reconstructive and it's not actually accurate as to how he came to that conclusion. Right? And so these are kind of two alternative views of how human reasoning works that I think are kind of in powerful opposition to each other. And these are some of the things that we're going to try to tell apart here. The way we're going to try to tell this apart is, first, we're just going to test whether LLMs are actually capable of reasoning the way that people do, whether they can actually be empirically adequate models. Right? Before we try to look into them and understand how they're doing it, we have to establish that they are in fact doing the same thing. And really, everything I'm going to tell you for the rest of this talk is just going to be this first part. The looking at the internals, I'm going to kind of give a very, very high level description of how we're currently doing that at the very end. But this first part is already highly non-trivial because up until very recently, this wasn't even a candidate in the running. Like nobody thought that connectionist neural networks, or LLMs in particular, could reason the way that people do, as well as people do. If you ever remember playing around with GPT-1 or GPT-2, it was extremely easy to break it. It was extremely easy to get it to act in a way that was just dumb. And it's gotten massively harder just in the last 2 or 3 years. Right? And so now this is a question that we can sort of reasonably ask, right? So can LLMs actually match humans? And we're going to pick a very particular task that has these nice properties of deploying logical concepts in a kind of rational way. And this is a task, the history of this task actually goes back to the 1950s. It's a task that was originally used by Jerry Bruner and colleagues. But there's a kind of recent version of it by Steve Piantadosi et al. From this 2016 paper that I think is a really beautiful implementation, a really beautiful way to think about this. So here's the task. And if we were live, I'd get you to kind of shout this out loud to me and we would do it together, but that doesn't work as well on Zoom. So I'm going to act like I was the audience, like I was all of you, and just kind of give you how I would do the task. Maybe it's similar to how you would do it. So here's the task: is you get a couple of shapes. You get like somewhere between 3 and 5 on the screen at a time. And your job is to guess which of those are woodsy. Okay. And you start out having absolutely no idea what that means. So you're just guessing. And every guess that you make on every set of objects, you're going to get feedback. So here, it doesn't really matter what you guess, but you're told that the blue one is not woodsy. Sorry, that first one is not woodsy, and then both of those triangles are. Right? So now you might have some guesses about what it is to be woodsy. Maybe it means something like triangle. 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 like green or purple. Maybe it means something like any shape that there are two of, right? There are a bunch of different things that it could mean here that are consistent. Then you get another set of evidence and you just have to guess all over again, right? And so again, you go through and you get feedback, and the feedback tells you that these objects are woodsy. So, okay, so that rules out the hypothesis that they're triangles, they're not triangles. So now, I don't know about you, but I might think that it's something like green or purple. That seems to be consistent with the evidence that I've seen, both in the previous trial and this trial. And so you get this and you just keep iterating on this task. You keep doing this over and over again. I should say behind the scenes, the shapes vary between three different shapes, so triangles, squares, and circles, three different colors, so whatever, blue, green, and purple here, and three different sizes of shapes. They're small, medium, and large. So those are sort of the dimensions of variation, and all of the rules, underneath each run for each participant, there's a different rule that decides what Z actually is. And so participants essentially, to get this right, have to converge to something that is that rule or close enough to that rule, right, equivalent to that rule. Okay, so now if I asked you to guess which ones are woodsy, here, you might guess the green one because that's consistent with everything you've seen. I can tell you actually in this particular run with this specific rule and these specific objects, the rule was same shape as a purple object. That's consistent with all of the evidence that you saw before. And so in this case, none of these two are woodsy because there was no purple object on the screen. So if you would get feedback here that neither of these is woodsy. So the point is just to show you, like, some of these rules are easier, some of these rules are harder, some of them are really pretty unintuitive. Right, in this kind of task, probably most people don't spontaneously think of something as same shape as a purple object. But actually, one of the striking findings here about people is that if you give them enough objects and you give them enough feedback, they will be able to converge on some fairly complicated rules that don't come to mind initially. Okay. Now, what Piantadosi and colleagues did in that 2016 paper is they built a computational model that explained how it is that people do this. And the computational model was very much a symbolic model of the kind that Fodor and Polition would have very strongly endorsed. It's essentially a Bayesian hypothesis testing algorithm that has primitives that are the sizes, the shapes, the colors of the shapes, and then certain logical operators that combine them. So things like or, things like and, things like if, and then also some really like weird logical operators that you might not think of, like NAND and NOR and XOR. These are just like Boolean logical operators that are not very easy for people to reason with generally. The point of their paper, which I think is a really, really beautiful kind of way to go about it, was to try different models with different logical primitives and see which one matches human learning trajectories on this task the best. And it turns out that a model that just has basically and, or, and not does a very good job of modeling, what it is that people can come up with in these rules. So this is from their paper. This is data of model predictions and human responses. This is for that best performing model. That's basically just a full Boolean model. This is like shockingly tight fit between any computational model and humans. This is like on kind of any individual response, how likely are they to match, right? What I most love about this paper and this task is that you don't have to look at performance on aggregate. You can actually look at performance trial by trial. So here on the x-axis is like the number of objects that you've seen so far, right? So I showed you 3, and then I showed you 6, and then I showed you 8, right? And then how accurate you are on each of those objects as a function of how many objects you've seen. And so there are going to be, the idea here is that as you form a hypothesis, your accuracy will go up, but then at some point you might find that your hypothesis is wrong, right? That you guess incorrectly. And if people are sort of converging on the same hypothesis, and if the model is converging on the same hypothesis as people, they should be right and wrong in about the same places, right? So the same object that disconfirms one person's hypothesis should disconfirm another's if they have the same hypothesis, or should disconfirm the models if they have the same hypothesis at that point. And so you can look at a match not just in how accurate people are relative to the model overall, or by the time they've learned the rule towards the end of all the objects, but in this kind of ongoing, unfolding hypothesis testing process, object by object, trial by trial. And so in the 2016 paper, they show, I think really compellingly, this is kind of the state of the art, this Bayesian model that does perfectly rational inference, right? So given all of the evidence that you've seen, what is the hypothesis that fits that evidence the best? Now, it's not purely that. They also have a kind of bias towards shorter hypotheses over longer ones. There's a couple of there's also like a little bit of a parameter of occasionally exploring a little bit more than you would if you were like a perfectly rational reasoner, to not get stuck in local maxima. But broadly, this is kind of very good Bayesian reasoning. Was a good model of human hypothesis testing. Now, you can see that there are some cases where the model is better than others. So there are some cases like circle or blue where the model is really a very, very good fit trial by trial for what people do. There are other cases like circle and blue or triangle and green where humans actually generally do better than the model. Right? Like more people seem to converge on the right hypothesis than the model overall. There are also cases where the model does better than people. I'll actually show you some of those in a minute. Okay, so what we did is we took this same task and we just converted it into something that basically ChatGPT could understand. So instead of showing it, we wanted to control exactly kind of how we fed in the input. So we could have shown it just pictures, but we wanted to make sure that it was kind of getting the right dimensions that we thought people would be. There's an interesting question here that I can talk about later about just how much to control or kind of tailor the input to the task, right? There are lots of different kind of forms of labeling of the input that you could do here. But basically, we just convert this task to something that the model can understand. So we give it these objects and we say it's like a medium blue circle, large green triangle, and you have to decide if it's true or false, if it's woodsy or not, right? Same thing. Okay. So what we find here is that the best performing large language models, and we tested GPT-4, yeah, GPT-4 is right there. And there's a couple of others that you may not have heard of. I'll tell you why we use those in a second. There's kind of technical reasons for that, but I won't go into it too much unless that's relevant. But broadly, there's a bunch of models, a bunch of the best models that do as well as people do. Now, people aren't at 100% here because some of the rules are really hard to learn, as you saw. Models aren't either. Okay. And we can fine-tune the models, which means sort of after the model's already been trained. So take a fully trained model like GPT. It can't actually be GPT itself. So this is why we have to use some of those other models, because it has to be a model where we have access to its weights, to its kind of internals. And then we can fine-tune those internals on a subset of the tasks of the trials that people see here and test it on a withheld group of tasks to make sure that we're not overfitting. That's called the fine-tuning process. And if we fine-tune the models, we find that they fit both human overall performance and human learning trajectories better than the Bayesian probabilistic language of thought model, that kind of symbolic model, did. So this to us was huge and striking and shocking. And this is not what I expected to see. I expected this to not work at all, right? But if you just kind of think about what's required to do this task in a human-like way, right? You've got to formulate hypotheses that are like the hypotheses that people are formulating, at least close enough to them, if not exactly the same. And you've got to transition between those hypotheses from trial to trial as you get feedback in a way that is, again, close enough to how humans are doing it, right? And then, of course, there's the question of like, well, is that a perfectly kind of rational way or not? Now, the Bayesian model here implements, I think, something pretty close to a really, maybe not a perfectly rational way of doing it, but like a really, really good, reasonable way of doing it. The fact that the LLM is doing better than the Bayesian model, right, is telling us something better in matching people, not better in necessarily learning the rules. In fact, on average, it's doing a little bit less well at learning the rules, but better at matching people. It's telling us something about the human likeness of the LLM. Okay. Now, this is just for kind of full transparency. So that this particular rule, this is the unique object. This is the case where the LLM outperforms the Bayesian model by the most. So this is a case where the LLM is a really good match to what people do trial by trial, like an R squared of 0.88. That's a really high correlation between people and the model. And the Bayesian model is only at 0.36. So still, not zero, but generally not matching humans nearly as well. There are other cases where the Bayesian model does match people better than the LLM. This is the opposite case. This is the case where the LLM matches the worst. So this is the rule that is same color as another object. Right? So the human line here is in black, the LLM is in blue, and the Bayesian model is in that kind of dotted pale orange line. One thing also that you might notice is that the case where the LLM is not matching humans very well is also the case where the LLM is just not learning the rule very well. Right? So humans are kind of converging on something reasonable pretty early on after about 15 exemplars or so. And the large language model is just kind of hovering around chance for a long time, maybe kind of getting above chance at the end, but not even really clear if that's systematic. And this is actually one of my favorite findings from this project, is what we find is that Bayesian models can do really well, and the LLM can do really well too. But Bayesian models are capable of doing really well in a way that isn't very human-like. So here, basically what we're plotting is on the x-axis, how well the model, either the Bayesian model or the large language model, does at learning the rule by the end. And on the y-axis, we're plotting how human-like is it trial by trial in its kind of classification accuracy. Right? So in whether it's rating each thing as true or not. And what you find is that for the LLM, there are cases that it doesn't learn. There are cases that it doesn't learn and humans do. That's the kind of top left quadrant. But where it does learn stuff, so the right side of the plot here, most of the rules that it manages to learn in a human-like way. It manages to learn with a high R squared with human responses trial by trial. So there are very few dots in the lower right quadrant here. Compare that to the Bayesian model, where there are more cases where the Bayesian model succeeds in learning the rule, but does it in a way that doesn't correspond to humans very well. I think one of the things that this rules out, which I think was very plausible, is this idea that there's kind of only one way to learn the rule for any given rule, for any given evidence and any given rule. Right? So it's just like you see particular rules, you form kind of the right hypothesis. Of course, if you see that triangles are woodsy and squares are not, you're now going to form the hypotheses that squares are woodsy. That's just like contradicts your evidence. And so there's a sense in which like the evidence just pushes you to narrow the hypotheses in a particular way as long as you're being consistent with the evidence. And no matter what kind of model you are, there's kind of only one way to do that. And so everybody is going to match humans reasonably well. What this result is showing us is that that's not true. You can actually learn a rule very well, maybe even in a rationally kind of optimal way, and it won't be very human-like, right? That's what the Bayesian model is doing more often. Okay. Here's another thing that we thought to try, and this is a bit of a crazy thing. If you're a computer scientist or a LLM researcher, this is just not something that you would think like would be a good thing to do. We asked the LLM after each trial what its own rule was, like what rule was it actually using. The reason this is like a sketchy and wonky thing to do is that there's no architectural reason that the LLM shouldn't just make stuff up. I mean, you're just prompting it, right? You're saying like, okay, how did you just decide which ones were true, which ones were false? It could say anything, right? It could say like the rain in Spain. It could say whatever. It could say something that's kind of within the domain, like the green ones or something, but that has nothing to do with how it actually decided. Right? So to our sort of shock and surprise, we took the output that the LLM gave us, and we checked whether if you were to use the rule that the LLM said it was using, whether you would categorize the objects as true or false in the way that the LLM actually categorized them. Right? So whether the rule that it's telling you it used actually matches what rule it looks like it used. And the answer to that is that 97% of the time they match. This again was like massively surprising. There's no reason why this necessarily should be the case, right? It could be deciding to categorize objects one way and then making up a totally different unrelated rule. Right? It's not doing that. It seems to be producing a rule that is actually concordant with its own decisions. Okay, so given that, we can look at what rule it's producing, and we can look at the rule that at any given time the Bayesian model thinks is the most probable, which can actually articulate in symbolic terms. Like there, it's sort of more transparent. We can look at the internals of the Bayesian model. It just spits out what it thinks the most likely rule is, articulated in its kind of symbolic language. And we can compare the two. So for example, if the true rule was not circle, right? The Bayesian model for that rule says not circle, so it converges on the right rule by the end. The LLM converges on triangle or rectangle, which is actually in this case equivalent because there are only three shapes. So triangle or rectangle is the same thing as not circle in this task, in the context of this task. Of course, not in general, right? But there's nothing to tell them apart. And so we can look at two things. One is just like, is the rule that they come up with equivalent to the true rule? That's the truth conditionally equivalent part. And is it consistent with the evidence that they've seen? And so for some rules, the answer is yes to both on both the Bayesian model and the LLM. This is, again, like none of this had to be this way, right? This is already kind of really surprising. We can look at other rules. So there are cases where the true rule is like larger than a blue object. The Bayesian model comes up with larger than a blue object. That's right. And the LLM comes up with something that's equivalent-ish, large and blue or purple, triangle or rectangle. Right? It turns out it's still very consistent with the evidence that it's seen. It's not actually equivalent to the true rule. Now we can ask a question of, which of these is more like the rule that people use? Now, one snag with asking that question is that unfortunately, on this task, and this is something that Piantadosi et al. Reported back in 2016, people are very bad at reporting what rule they're using. So if you just ask them, how are you doing this? How did you just decide the way that we asked the LLM? It's not that they're wrong. It's not that they tell you something totally off the wall. It's that they either don't really know, or they say something that is actually just not specific enough to make, to map to their decision. So they might say like, I picked the tall one. It's like, well, what does that mean? Like the big one. It's like, what does that mean? Like the biggest one or the only one that's big or, the big square one? Like what exactly does that mean? And people just don't formulate the rules that they express specifically enough to really be the rules that they're using to value on this. So people maybe don't have quite good internal access to this, maybe not as good as the LLM does, surprisingly. Okay, now there are other rules that nobody gets exactly right. So when the true rule is something like if circle, then blue, this is like a material conditional circle implies blue. The PLOT converges, the Bayesian model converges on not circle. The LLM converges on rectangle or triangle. Rectangle or triangle is again equivalent to not circle, but neither of these is exactly right. And neither of them is exactly consistent with the evidence either. Okay. Ooh, I'm really running out of time. Okay, I'll try to wrap up real quick here. So what we've learned is that LLMs seem to use systematically different rules than the Bayesian model, and LLM's behavior is more human-like on a kind of trial-by-trial basis. They're a better match to human performance than the Bayesian model is. That suggests that LLM's underlying representations, like how they're actually doing this, might be more human-like too. And I think there are two options for how they're more human-like. One option is that the rules that they're selecting, based on the previous evidence that they've seen, they're doing that selection process in a more human-like way. They're doing that kind of hypothesis testing and proposing new possible rules in a more human-like way than an optimal kind of Bayesian reasoner. The other possibility, and that could be that, we can ask whether they're basing their rule that they select on the relevant evidence, or maybe also on some prior, or maybe also on some interpretation of what the person is doing. Are they maybe systematically modifying the previous rule? It looks like LLMs have this tendency to concatenate, additional features with the previously expressed rule that they had before. Is that more human-like? Is that more like what people tend to do, rather than just at every time step throw out your previous guess and come up with the next best guess given all the previous evidence? That's more like what the Bayesian model is doing, and maybe that's less human-like. So that's one possibility for what's going on here. The other is that the elements of the rules themselves might be more human-like. So of course, in this particular task, right, the rules are formulated as Boolean rules, or with these notions like the same as another shape, right? So they're sort of defined in these formal ways, and the LLM is expressing them in this formal way, but maybe its underlying representations are ones that kind of entangle particular logical operators with particular shapes or particular sizes or particular colors. So there isn't this kind of totally independent logical formal reasoning process in the LLM. And again, maybe there isn't in humans either. And so by investigating how the LLMs are doing this, we might be able to learn something about what the operators are. Okay, I'm well out of time. So I was going to tell you something about how there's techniques to actually do this. Wasn't going to go into any detail on any of those. Um, what I was going to say is that we can use the LLMs to ask whether there is a single underlying representation of the rule that they are using both for the categorization behavior and for telling us what rule they're using when we ask them. So that's kind of that rule elicitation. Whether those are two separate representations, whether one is affected by the current trial that they're actually looking at and trying to decide about, even though they haven't gotten feedback on that yet. So it shouldn't affect their hypothesis testing or not. These are all kind of questions that we can ask with techniques that allow us to look at the internals of the model. And again, given just the finding that LLMs are very, very human-like on this task, more human-like than our best state-of-the-art symbolic model up to that point, we're going to be able to disentangle these alternatives. So I won't kind of go into this now. But just to sum up, the case against connectionism really rests on behavior, on connectionist models being empirically inadequate. Symbolic structures, up until very recently, were argued to be and really were the best game in town for tasks that require things like logical reasoning, compositionality. That's just not the case anymore. Now, we don't know how it is that LLMs are doing these tasks. We don't know how they work. And so we don't know what the fact that they're succeeding on this task in a human-like way tells us exactly. But that just makes it more important for us to study them to figure out, right, what it means. The fact that they succeed on tasks that are classically symbolic sometimes gets taken as evidence that we don't need symbolic structure anymore. I think that's the wrong conclusion. I think that's a mistake. Instead, what it looks like is that LLM success is at least correlated, right, with their increasingly symbolic-like, structured, rationally transitioning internal representations. Right? This task, I think, is really, really good evidence for the fact that the hypotheses that an LLM is proposing are, in some sense, rational. They're good fits to the evidence. They're based on the hypothesis that it just proposed. Right? It really satisfies a lot of the criteria that Fodor laid out in this requirement for reasoning to transition in a truth-preserving way. And so maybe this kind of notion of associationism, just looking for correlations between inputs, and having a built-in symbolic structure, they're not exactly opponents, right? Maybe something close enough to symbolic, if not exactly symbolic, can emerge from the process of learning the statistics of the input. That seems to be the kind of radical cognitive theory that LLMs are really pushing me towards. All right, so I just want to thank my collaborators. Ellie Pavlik is at Brown Computer Science, and she's a collaborator on both of these projects. Sam McGrath was a philosophy student here who just started as an assistant professor in philosophy at Fordham University in New York. He led the project on the first part that I talked about, that current directions paper, kind of the philosophy project, the one that's titled How Deep Learning Can Inform Theory in Psychological Science. Jake Russin is a postdoc in Brown Neuroscience here who also worked on that project. And Alyssa Liu was a brilliant undergrad thesis student who led that entire empirical part, that whole second part that I showed you about. And she graduated and now works at Anthropic, making better language models there. And this is my lab when I'm not doing this kind of stuff. This is where we do development things. So thank you all for your time. Sorry that I went a bit over. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Roman. Fantastic talk, really fascinating stuff. We're past 5, but Roman has kindly agreed to hang around and answer some questions, and hopefully we can have a discussion. There are a few questions in the chat bar. Tracy has starred in the chat bar, and maybe Tracy, if you want to turn on your microphone and pick one of your questions to start off with. Which of your 3 questions would you like to lead with?
Thanks. Thank you, Roman. And sorry, I've got a terrible cold, so I hope I'm not coming off a little bit stuffy, but um, I was fascinated by what you shared and just sort of all the terminology that's being used. It's quite new to me, and I'm just getting used to this idea of training these LLM models and why it is that they so closely match humans. My first question was basically, we're talking about can they have reason? And I'm just thinking, well, if you can train it to look like it has reason, maybe it doesn't have reason, but you can train it in trains of thought, which makes it look like it has reason. So is it just, are we playing with words here, or is it not being, is it not reasoning? That was my first question. The other questions I had were just basically about sort of stretching a little bit your definitions and trying to understand if the mere implementation of these things had to do with forms and structures. I also think it has to do with function and like how do humans use the game of chess? I mean, is it just for pleasure or is it to learn strategy? There are other angles to it that maybe don't come into a natural thought process there, but I'll leave space for other people's questions. But it was mainly on general terminology. I'm just sort of getting immersed in this right now. I don't really know, and so I'm just curious about your thoughts about how we're defining these terms.
Yeah, so let me say a little bit, I guess, first just about like the basic terminology I was using. So when we talk about training an LLM, that's a kind of technical term that is for these models like ChatGPT. They are pre-trained, which means by the time they're released, they've already been trained. And what that training is essentially they start out with you can think of them as essentially very, very large matrices of numbers. That's really all they are. They're mathematical objects. Right? They can be computationally implemented in different ways, but fundamentally, an LLM is a type of mathematical object. Um, and those matrices are initialized with absolutely random numbers. People have actually tried different initializations. It turns out that absolutely random numbers work just fine. Now, what you do is you just ask it. So each of those numbers corresponds to some, like, let's say we're training it on language, some part of a word, right? And so you're asking it, multiply vectors in this matrix in a way that correctly predicts the next word that you're going to see. And then you give it that next word and you just, that's the feedback. Did it predict correctly or not? Then there's a process called backpropagation, but again, different kind of ways of doing it, that just adjusts the numbers in those vectors, the weights in whatever they're called, the weights again, they're just numbers in a matrix, to make it more likely that given those previous inputs, it would have produced the right output. So it's just like training feedback. So that's why it's called training, and that's the whole thing. Is it sounds like it's sort of more human-like or something. It's really just the process of adjusting numbers in a matrix.
Right, but
There's
instead of just the word, the question is, can you train it in trains of thought? In how the humans have these points of logic, instead of just word by word and most likely next word, could you train it in whole patterns of trains of thought and make it look like it had reason?
Yeah, so these are sort of different parts of the process of a language model. So the training part happens before you even get to interact with the model as the user. I think what you're referring to by trains of thought, there's this thing called chain of thought prompting, which has now been incorporated into lots of models, which is it's like the silliest hack ever. It's essentially asking the model a question and then asking it to quote unquote think step by step. Right? At some point, people figured out that if you just add those magic words, think step by step, the model does do that, and it produces a better answer than it otherwise would have. So this instruction to think step by step, it's called chain of thought prompting. It just makes the model behave ultimately much better. We actually didn't do that here. We didn't do any chain of thought prompting in this particular task. So everything I showed you was just like the model's first kind of output. But when you talk about training it on chains of thought, this is why I was really emphasizing the kind of number prediction aspect of this. The only thing you can train it on really is next token prediction, like predicting the next word or the next subword. That's the only thing that is going to adjust its internal weights. Then this other chain of thought prompting thing, that happens after the model's already been trained, when you start interacting with it as a user. And that does, now, whether it's reasoning or not reasoning, I think that the operative question is like, well, how would you tell, right? You ask it a question that you would think requires reasoning. You ask it to think step by step. It gives you steps that look very much like that kind of Sherlock Holmesian rational, inferential process. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's faking it somehow, but like it's a pretty good fake.
Super. Thanks, Tracy. I'll take another question from the chat from Attila. He says, excellent talk and project. Could you get back to the question on how the internals of the neural network can be checked?
Yes. So this was the part that I skipped over at the very, very end. There's a couple of different techniques that you can use, and these are being sort of rapidly developed. By the way, my favorite thing about these is that, so, LLMs are usually considered a black box because we don't know how they work. These techniques go by the name of white box techniques because I guess white is the opposite of black. I just think this is hilarious because we don't know how white boxes, like we can't look inside a white box any better than we can look inside a black box. It's just a different color of box. So anyway, whatever. I think that's just like a ridiculous name. But anyway, so there are a bunch of these kind of like white box mechanistic interpretability techniques. Yeah, glass box, translucent box, open box, any of those would be better, but white box is kind of the going name. So yes, so one of the things that we can do is we can essentially, so this requires networks where we actually can see the weights, like we have the matrix of numbers. Most kind of commercial LLMs that you can play with are not like that. So ChatGPT is not like that. Its weights are proprietary, like OpenAI doesn't tell you what they are. Claude is not like that. A bunch of them are not like that. But there are other LLMs that have been developed that are pretty close to those mainstream production ones in performance, sometimes equivalent, sometimes actually even better on certain tasks, where the weights are open, namely, like the entire matrix of weights with a billion parameters is published. And you can take those weights and now you can do various things with them. So those weights are in some sense the internals of the model. But what you can do is you can basically, so you can remove parts of the weights, like you can zero out or blank out parts of the weights and see how much that affects performance on a given task. It turns out that you can zero out quite a lot without breaking a model's performance on a particular task. Like maybe you're breaking its performance on other tasks, but you're not breaking its performance on this task. So using that kind of approach, you can find like subnetworks, right, that are actually the parts of the model that are responsible for any particular task. You can also do things, and this is now becoming the real kind of gold standard way of doing it, and I think for a good reason. You can do kind of causal interventions. So once you've identified a subnetwork that you think is doing a particular task, you can take those weights, you can grab literally grab just a part of the matrix, part of those numbers, and plug them in to another network that has different other weights, maybe it's trained differently, or there's a couple of different ways to do it. And see if that will now make it behave in the way that you would expect it to if that subnetwork was actually doing the thing that you thought it was doing, right? So there's this kind of like causal manipulation that you can do, an intervention. So it's not just like ablating it. A lot of this sounds like neuroscience techniques, like trying to understand brain damaged patients, especially, right? I think that's not an accident. Like a lot of this is kind of doing neuroscience, a sort of cognitive neuroscience on language models. So those are the sorts of things that you can do. That's just like a very, very high level description of these techniques. What we're doing is we're actually trying to write down different causal graphs that we think might be underlying. So, maybe I'll just go back to this slide because I think it's easier to talk about this with a picture. Share my screen again. So there are essentially different hypotheses that you might have about what is causing the categorization behavior and the elicited rule. The elicited rule is like the model's own statement of what rule it's using to categorize. And you can imagine that there's this kind of like Fodor's Sherlock type of reasoner who really has the same representation underlying both behaviors, right? Like it has formulated some idea of what the rule is, and it's using that both to decide on any given object, is that object true or false? And it's also using that to tell you what rule it's using when you ask, right? So there's a common representation there underlying both behaviors. That's one story for how this could go. Another story is that there are actually two, in some sense, really separate representations underlying this behavior that are tied together by the fact that ultimately you're getting the same evidence, right? So you're getting common evidence, and you use that evidence to form one representation that allows you to categorize, and a maybe unrelated representation that allows you to say what rule you're using. And the reason that those match up is because ultimately the evidence is the same, not because they're internally the same, right? I think that's another kind of live possibility. The third one, and this is kind of like the Kahneman rationalization story, is that you might have one representation of the rule that leads you to categorize. But once you've categorized a particular set of objects, or once you've seen what objects you're being asked to categorize, before you've gotten any feedback on those that should actually update what you think the rule is, you're already going to change the representation that leads to you saying what you think the rule is. So in other words, you've seen some evidence that should formulate some idea of what you think is the rule, the underlying rule. But that's not directly what you say when you're asked what you think the rule is. What you say depends on that representation, plus the objects that you're currently being asked to evaluate, or how you already evaluated them before you've gotten any feedback. So these are sort of the alternatives that we're testing now, and we can test them to some extent behaviorally, but to some extent we can actually look at the internals of the model. We can identify elements that we think are something corresponding to R1 and something corresponding to R2, and then we can ask, are those the same as each other? If they are, if they're exactly the same representation, that will tell us that we're in Fodor's Sherlock world, right? That there's a common R. We can ask if one is affected by the other, that will tell us whether we're in Kahneman's rationalization world. So all of this is stuff that we're currently doing. I don't have results I want to take to the bank just yet, but I just want to give you like a flavor for this is the kind of way that you might go about this, and this is where I think the really exciting action is going to be, right? Like doing stuff to these models, doing a kind of like neuroscience, surgically playing with their weights, moving weights from one network to another and seeing what that does. These are things like you just in principle cannot do with humans. And they might actually tell us something, the behavioral effects of those surgical changes might tell us something about their behavior in a way that we can then make inferences back about how humans work. So this is some of the exciting stuff that I think is kind of happening. All right, I'll stop sharing again.
Super fascinating stuff. I'm going to ask an educational neuroscience type question. So in educational neuroscience, the relevance of neuroscience to education is the idea that how the brain works kind of matters for education. So when it comes to AI, the kind of reasoning goes that AI has been showing us that there are different ways we can that artifacts or anything, that different ways you can think or you can learn, and that humans learn in the particular way they do because of biology, and biology is the way it is because of evolution. And these are sort of very broadly construed implementation constraints, and they are relevant in an educational context. So things like sleep and emotion and reward schedules and stuff like that. These aren't necessary ways you can do things. It just happens to be the way humans do it. So we know, for example, that deep reinforcement learning can create artifacts that can play chess better than humans, but they do it in a way that differentially weights position versus pieces, for example. Right? So there's different ways you can do it. So I'm wondering, following your work, where you think these kind of large language models sit in terms of human-like versus non-human-like. So, for example, in terms of implementation constraints, the amount of energy they take and the amount of training they've had don't look human-like. But in some of the behavioral ways you're talking about, they're beginning to look human-like. So what do you think on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are exactly the right kind of empirical questions, and this is why um, I think the first step in this kind of research program is to establish that they're behaviorally human-like, right? Unlike, for example, the reinforcement learning program, yes, they're not behaviorally human-like. They're better than humans, right? In lot like Stockfish plays chess way better than any human alive and has for a long time now. So that's a kind of evidence that the internals are different and they're different in a way that is relevant to behavior. Now, there's no doubt that the internals of a model are in some sense different than the internals of humans, at least in the fact that, we're hunks of meat and they're not. The question is which aspects of that are relevant to the behavior or not. And I think this is where the chess metaphor is sort of a good metaphor to think about, because that's an extreme case where implementation really doesn't matter, right? Like there's just so many different ways to implement chess. Maybe there are some ways in which chess just cannot be implemented. Maybe you can't implement chess in flowing water or something because it moves on its own and it won't stay still and you can't play chess that way or something. But so like it's not like the medium of implementation doesn't constrain the implementability at all. But I think what's so striking about language models here is that they've converged on human-like behavior without any particular pressure that forced them to do that. Like one of the things, I didn't mention this actually, but one of the things I really like about this particular task that I was showing you is that we're pretty confident that is not a task that the model was ever trained on, right? So in a lot of cases where you test language models, there's kind of worries about like data contamination, that in its training data, when the model was in the process of like adjusting its internal weights in the first place, it already saw this kind of thing. And so you think it's doing something novel, but actually it's just like regurgitating something that it had already seen. With this task, because we took a kind of visual task that had, like there's some version of that task in a GitHub repository online, but we translated it into text in a way that the LLM had definitely never seen before. So we can be pretty confident that it's not just cheating that way. And the fact that it's converged on human-like behavior, given that, just was not necessary. Like it just didn't have to happen that way. So I definitely don't want to draw from that the conclusion that there are no relevant differences between the LLM and the human. Like there are obviously differences, and there are probably relevant differences to how humans learn versus how LLMs learn, how humans behave versus how LLMs behave. But there's a surprising amount of kind of invariance, right? Like one way to think about this is, are we climbing the same mountain from two different directions, or are we actually climbing two different mountains, right? The direction, the path that you take up the mountain is still going to matter for sure, but it's at least informative if it actually turns out that we're kind of climbing the same mountain as opposed to different mountains. The chess engines that use reinforcement learning, I'm very confident that they are climbing a different mountain. I mean, they're learning the same game in some sense, but they're just not ending up with anything like what humans are ending up with. LLMs might be ending up with something like what humans are ending up with through a very different path.
Great. Can I ask you one last question from an educational perspective again? So educators will be a little bit worried about getting ChatGPT to come up with facts because we know they can confabulate. They may be getting better, but quite often they'll come up with things that are probably true rather than actually true. So I'm just wondering, when you move into the area of reasoning, are you concerned that there are going to be limitations about, or types of errors that these large language models might make in reasoning, particularly when you start to get into more sort of grounded content rather than these colors and shapes, and there's space then for what's probably true and the kind of biases you find out on the internet and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't, so there's two questions. One is, are language models going to be human-like in terms of the errors that they make? Because of course, humans make lots of errors in reasoning too. And the other question is like, are they actually going to be correct? Like, are they going to be better than humans, arguably. Are they going to make fewer errors in certain cases, at least? So there's a bunch of evidence that they do make human-like errors, again, in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So, for example, one of the kind of best documented types of mistakes that humans make in reasoning is goes under the umbrella name of content effects. So, how likely humans are to endorse a conclusion given a bunch of premises depends on how much they believe that conclusion already, independently. And it's harder for people to reason through premises to conclusions that contradict what they believe, even if the reasoning itself is really is good, is valid, than it is to endorse conclusions that they already believe, even if the reasoning isn't necessarily as good. It turns out that LLMs have the same sort of content effects. So if you just give, this is a study by Ishita Dasgupta and a whole bunch of people at DeepMind. I think actually most of them are in the UK and DeepMind. But they basically gave LLMs these sorts of syllogisms, like, A's are B's, some B's are C's, are some A's C's, right? Or plugging in different contents. All C's are puddles, some puddles are rivers, or like these sorts of things. And they find that, so humans are going to endorse the reasoning more when the conclusions are things that they already believe. They find that the models do the same thing. Humans are less good at distinguishing valid from invalid reasoning when it's articulated in terms of like A's and B's and C's than in terms of things they already believe or just sensible statements. Models do the same. So again, didn't have to be that way, right? That's like a surprising, like, I don't think that models were trained to display that kind of behavior. So again, there's some evidence that they are human-like in ways that we, didn't necessarily expect. But that also just means that they're fallible in ways that like are not necessarily great if you want really infallible things. So like if you want to do some arithmetic, I really hope you use a calculator and not an LLM, right? A calculator is doing it in a way that is verifiably correct. An LLM may do it in a way that is mostly correct, sometimes incorrect, and not easy to verify one way or the other.
Great, that's super. Thanks so much for a fascinating talk, Roman. I think we should wrap up now. So, everyone, round of applause for a fascinating talk. Thanks so much, Roman. We look forward to following your work in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.